Welcome to the Kolbecast, episode 278. Thank you for joining us. Today, Bonnie and I are joined by Dr. Daniel Kuebler. Dr. Kuebler is a biology professor at Franciscan University, vice president of the Society of Catholic Scientists, a podcast host, and the list goes on. He's also the author of a new book from Word on Fire Press, Darwin and Doctrine, The Compatability of Evolution and Catholicism. Dr. Kuebler takes us through many of the ideas found in his book and helps us to see how the science of evolution can fit beautifully with natural philosophy and the teachings of the Church. It's definitely a book worth picking up, but join us for a brief discussion of what you'll find in its pages. We hope that you'll enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Colby homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn, and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and director of development for Kolbe Academy.
Good morning, Stephen. How are you?
Doing very well. Seasons are changing. Well, we have a hint of fall here in the South where it's like, 55 degrees this morning. We might be moving to fall. Now I realize in 2 weeks, we're probably going to be back up in the 90s, but
yes.
Anyway,
we'll take
fall
it.
is lovely. Yeah, we'll take a little break.
Yes, we're enjoying it too. That's great. We are happy to welcome back a Kolbecast guest whom we met in episode 222, Dr. Daniel Kuebler, who serves as professor of biology at Franciscan University of Steubenville, one of Kolbe's college partners. In that conversation, we visited about Dr. Kuebler's liberal arts background and his ultimately becoming a biologist, the intersection of science and faith, helping students with the big questions, and his work both in adult stem cell research and with the Magis Center's Purposeful Universe Initiative, among many other things that anytime I make a list, I know I'm leaving several things out. He also mentioned a book he had in the works at that time, and today we're delighted to announce that Darwin and Doctrine, published by Word on Fire, is now available. Congratulations, and welcome back to the Kolbecast, Dan.
Well, thanks, Bonnie and Steve, and it's great to be here, and yeah, it's great to have the book out, and thanks for having me back on.
We had such a good time talking with you. It's hard to believe it's been about a year since that conversation. And at that time, I think you had the book finished and it was working its way through the publishing process. So catch us up a bit on how you've been and what's been going on aside from launching the book into the world.
Yeah, well, I can't believe it's been a year. It seems like it was just on with talking to you guys, but yeah, I'm also vice president of the Society of Catholic Scientists, and so we've launched a number of major things this past year, and we launched a podcast that we focus on science and faith issues from a Catholic perspective, but also we have just scientists talking about their life journey, their conversions, their research, and so it's a mix of different things called the Catholic Scientist podcast, and so that's been something I've been working on this past year, and been doing more teaching of science and faith. So I have an undergraduate course that I co-teach with a philosophy professor on science and faith, and so we offered it last year. We're offering it for the second time this year, so we just had our first class this week, and yeah, it's been a lot of fun. The two of us, we haven't gotten into any fist fights yet in the middle of the class, but we've gotten into some good discussions, and I think the students appreciate that, to see that, there's space amongst good Orthodox Catholics to sort of debate certain issues without being a heretic, So I think they see that the intellectual depth of some of these interesting questions that come up in these classes. We talk about evolution, we talk about cosmology, we talk about quantum physics, we talk a good, stem cells, transhumanism, a lot of range of topics, and it's really nice for me to have another faculty member in the course, particularly when we get to certain philosophical questions where I can sort of shadow box my way through them if I was by myself, but there I can be like, okay, why don't you handle this one there and turn off. So this is Dr. Paul Symington. He teaches philosophy here at Franciscan. So the two of us have been teaching. I enjoy it, and students, the first time we offered it, we didn't get that many students because nobody knew what it was, but now we're getting students coming out of the woodwork wanting to take the course. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to probably teaching it with them every semester. So I really enjoy that course.
That sounds ideal. Just both the subject matter, addressing the topics that you mentioned, and being able to observe the conversation that you're having and the way you guys are approaching that, and working your way through that in a civil manner. It's like really a bonus, like key component of that. And that's great.
Yeah, yeah. No, I learned a lot in that class just from listening to his lectures and then listening, and this year we've changed some things, but we'll have more of interactions between the two of us. So that's always fun. And I think the students really appreciate that when they see their professors talking back and forth. It engages them rather than just, oh, here's another lecture. So I think yeah, it's almost like listening to a podcast in the front of the class, which can be a lot more engaging sometimes. So.
Hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking that last time we talked about this, and it's certainly part of your book as well. But that that natural philosophy and natural science kind of two separate things. They approach things in a different way. Maybe I'm not using those terms exactly correctly, but modern science, and then like St. Thomas and the philosophy and how their subject matter is different things, but they've been apart too long. It's been a strong desire of mine to see them come together, and that sounds like what's happening here.
Yeah, definitely. And that was what we just that was our first lecture, just talking about how these two things interact. How does science, modern science, modern empirical science like biology and physics and chemistry, what is their subject matter, what they find about the world, how does that inform and help shape, good philosophy, and how does good philosophy help form and shape how science should approach its subject matter, and seeing how both of them can enrich each other if done properly. And you're right, they've been stripped apart, and so many people, many scientists will engage in philosophical claims and discussions without even realizing they're doing philosophy. They think they're doing science, and it's just sort of recognizing the scope. There's nothing wrong with a scientist, delving into philosophy. We're all amateur philosophers to some extent, but they have to recognize that's what they're doing and then do the philosophy well and look at the resources of good philosophy, particularly, as a Catholic, for the Catholic philosophical tradition, which is so rich, and helps enlighten all of these issues that we that modern science brings to the fore. So.
Well, I sure appreciate how you present all of that and kind of walk us through. I appreciate you making that distinction between when the scientists veer into philosophy. You've also talked a lot about integrating truths of science and theology as it relates to um, sort of establishing a framework for our discussion on evolution that we're having today, and how evolution and Catholicism are compatible. Are there any kind of uh, high level remarks that you like to start from in that arena where you're kind of introducing the concept of integrating these truths of science and theology?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I try to focus on with my students, and I love Pope Benedict on this, and he said, and I'm sort of paraphrasing, he was talking about, what is the meaning of evolution, right? What's the purpose of it? What is the meaning behind it? And he realizes that that's not a scientific question, but that's the most important human question. So when science informs us, this is how this process works, and then we step back and say, well, what does it all mean? How do we integrate this into a consistent worldview? And that's where good philosophy helps us to sort of see how the Catholic worldview and what science has revealed can actually be integrated, and they can both inform and augment each other, right? Because we all are, at the end of the day, we all are interested in purpose and meaning, right? What is this for? What am I for? What's the world for? And what does it tell me about the way creation operates? That meaning behind it, which is not a scientific question, but you have to know the science properly to, understand to get to that next question, right? But that next question to me is the most interesting one. That's why I like talking about that, but that's not a scientific question, but it is, I think, at the heart of, of what humans are interested in.
I know we've talked about this before, and it's clearly in your book, but I love the fact that our church is kind of the perfect place to discuss this because we're concerned about the truth. What is true? I mean, everything that's true we know is from God. It's things we don't have to be afraid of like, well, what if we discover something in science that seems to conflict with something that the church proclaims or whatever? It's like, well, let's dig deeper. Let's figure out where yeah, we don't have to be afraid of the world being overturned. We know we're safe and free to explore. I think you bring that up many times, and it's important, I think.
Yeah, yeah, because there's always sometimes apparent conflicts, and I think it was John Paul II that said that, or it might have been Benedict again, but when you see that, it's either one of two things. We don't fully understand the doctrine or dogma, of the church. There's something that we're missing, or a piece that we it's not that it's wrong, we just don't fully understand it, or the science, we don't fully understand that we've got. So, and there's this need of humility and patience, there. And so the church has been very clear about that, I think in the last 50 years about, don't rush into saying, oh, these two things are incompatible, where you see maybe there is some incompatibility, maybe you just don't understand things enough. And that goes for all of us, no matter how well trained you are in science or how well trained in theology, maybe, there's something that we're missing and that we can see that. And I think with evolution and creation, I think that the more we look at, it's like the more I look at, the more things get revealed to me through looking at evolution, not only through the science, but through the lens of, say, what the church fathers talked about scripture, what the church teaches about science, and nature and the world around us in general. It starts to open up possibilities, and you see synergies there rather than, oh, we're trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, right? Which I think a lot of people think that's the way science and faith are. You're just trying to fix the problem there, but rather than seeing that, oh, there's maybe an issue there. Well, that's an opportunity for growth and learning and deepening our faith, right? I think that's something I really try to get to our stress on our students, right? We're not always going to have all the answers, but that doesn't mean that, oh, we'll never, there's no truth out there, right? The truth is bigger than we are, right? And that's the important thing. And you see that in science too, right? Science at its root is a mystery, right? So when you get down to like the quantum level of reality, right? You have this sort of deep mystery there of unpredictability. Well, yeah, I mean, it is this uncertainty of not knowing for sure, but there's a mystery there that it's hard to penetrate, and hard to fully grasp. As quantum physics is not something, like light being a wave and a particle at the same time. That doesn't make sense. We can't fully grasp it, but that's what reality is pointing towards. But that's same thing with the Trinity. I can't grasp that, but the truth is bigger than our brains.
Yes.
I heard you say on another recording that I was listening to, evolution and creation are two ways of understanding reality on different levels. Would you expand on that for us?
Yeah, so I mean, it's also you could reduce that to sort of scientific knowledge versus philosophical or theological knowledge. You're on two different planes. So the evolution as a scientific theory, and I'm using it. Some people try to turn evolution into make philosophical claims. Let's put that aside. But evolution as a scientific theory is trying to explain physical and material developments, right? And that's it, right? That's all it should be. That's at least modern empirical science. It's sort of said this is what we're going to focus on. And it's very good at focusing on those questions. And then the bigger question, like creation, like creation, what is it that is allows for this universe, this contingent? All the things that science studies are contingent. They don't have to exist. You don't have to exist. That tree doesn't have to exist. That squirrel. These are all contingent material things, and science is good at explaining change amongst these things. But why these things exist at all, and why they exist, and why we exist in a universe that has a certain amount of order in it, that's a question that goes beyond science, and that's where creation is answering, the Catholic sort of view of creation answers that question. Why is there something rather than nothing? And why is that something ordered? And why was it created? Those questions are at a different level than the questions of, well, how did say the first squirrel come into being in the world? Was there a physical process that played out, right? And so I think realizing you're asking different questions, they're related because we're talking about the same reality, right? So it's not like one's going to send us off into left field and the other one's going to send us off into right field, but they're at different levels, and you stack them on top of each other, and you get this beautiful view, I think, of reality.
Okay. How do you find students typically, when you present it to them that way, How does that tend to go over?
No, I think they understand that. I think I find two things with the students that or when I'm giving talks to Catholics about this. There's two things that and when I did the book, I focused on this in the few early chapters. Is they either don't fully understand what the church teaches about creation and Genesis, or they've got a misconception of evolution, right? Of what that is, right? So they have this idea that well, evolution is an atheistic theory. And I was like, well, no, the science of evolution is this, and let's look at that, right? And I always, focus on that evolution only works because there's a huge amount of order in creation. And if you take that order away, you know, um, evolution falls apart. It doesn't work. So it's dependent upon this order. And then Catholic understanding of creation is never been that the first chapter of Genesis has to be taken in a literal as historical. All right. Yeah, even Augustine, who wrote on the literal interpretation of Genesis, he meant, when he's using the word literal, he's saying, what's the plain meaning of the text, right? And I think, it's hard to argue that the plain meaning of the text is more poetical and pointing out these underlying deep truths that the church teaches about creation, that it's ordered, it's oriented towards worship, the seventh day, everything is oriented towards the Sabbath, and that creation is good, right? Those things are really what the church teaches about creation. It doesn't teach that, the earth is this many days old and so forth. Those are things that science is able to address and answer and can be integrated into the view of creation that the church has, that everything that exists is dependent upon God. It's ordered, it's good, and it's all pointed towards something. It's moving towards something, and that something is Christ, is God, right?
Really interesting that even this idea that you'll bring up again multiple times, the primary and secondary causes that are so important should be kept in mind when you're even looking at scripture, because of course it is written by God, the Holy Spirit, but it is also written by a man at some point,
Right.
whether it's St. Paul in the New Testament or Moses or whoever wrote those first books. So I mean, it would be actually wrong to expect somebody at the time of Moses to be going down and talking about an evolutionary theory or cell biology that
Right.
wasn't in their experience, their knowledge. They can't add they can't add that even if they wanted to at that point. So
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. God works through all of us, but he also respects who we are and our limitations and so forth. He doesn't just infuse us with all no, why didn't God, infuse us with all scientific knowledge? Why did we have to work so hard to gain the scientific knowledge as a species as we've had, right? So I think God wants us to respect what we know and use and work through us rather than sort of override us and make us sort of robots for his and it's a mystery of how that works. And I find that interesting because I think a lot of people think evolution, wow, it's just natural processes running, and so how could God be behind that? It seems like it's random and chance. So where's God in that? And I always, in the book, I talk a little bit about this at the end, the last chapter, but I think this is something that where evolution history and salvation history, there's many, many similarities between the two. So in salvation history, God works through flawed human beings, or through like King David and Solomon, and to bring about, you know, um, our salvation, right? And so God is working through these fallen people, but they can't disrupt, they can't throw God's plan off the rails. Somehow God is able to use all these fallen human beings to achieve his plan, which is to have, his son come through the Virgin Mary and save us, right? And that is what salvation history is all about. In evolutionary history, God works through natural causes to bring about the type of creature that will be able to know and love him in all eternity. And yeah, there's sort of chance events, and it doesn't seem, but extinctions and things like that. But that doesn't disrupt God's plan. God works through natural causes just as he does in salvation history. And you see some of the same themes, death and rebirth in both in evolution and in salvation history. So I think that when I look at the two, they sort of like mirror each other and they illuminate each other, which is, when I talked about how do you find meaning? How do we understand how to think about this? Well, as a Catholic, we think, how do we understand anything in the world? It should be through Christ. The Christ is sort of the interpretive key of understanding all of history, whether it's evolutionary history or salvation history. And that doesn't mean I use, Christ his life or salvation history or the Old Testament to help me do scientific research. But when I stand back and think, what does it all mean? That's sort of the lens that I look through, and that's the lens we should look through. And it does, I think, illuminate evolutionary history. It makes it seem as if, well, that not surprising that God would work through secondary causation and allow the creatures the freedom to be part of this process with him, just like he does in salvation history.
I really appreciated in the book both your clarifying that the world God made is set up to facilitate evolution. It's like I think you mentioned multiple times that it's likely that if you reset the process, I think you say at one point that you'd probably end up with very similar results. So you have this kind of like God's working through there, but it also, again, emphasized God both is there for in all existence. He's there, but there's also that principle like, well, yes, the wind blows through my backyard and this leaf falls, but God's not surprised by that. He's still part of that whole process. He knows and has moved everything kind of in that way. So I really enjoyed your balancing of that too, because as I'm starting thinking, it's like, okay, this is a clockmaker God now. He just made the things but you balance it out very well to show that that's not the case.
Yeah, that immanence of God, that God he's not nature, but he is part of everything. God is it's not as if we compete with God for causation or nature is competing with them. When nature does something, natural processes do something that reveals what God has done as well, right? And so I know Bishop Barron is really good about talking about this, and that God is just not one cause amongst many, some just bigger cause. No, God is the cause of all causes, and so science, what it reveals about the world is not taking away from the glory of God or God's causative power, because science only works because God allows and sustains the universe in existence and sustains a specific type of universe in existence that has a specific structure that actually allows for creatures like you and I to exist and to have evolved, right? And so I think that is a much richer, and it's actually a Catholic way of viewing God, right? He's not competing against somebody.
Whenever I get together with you, I'm thinking about all of my past, philosophy and science and the conflicts we would have at a place like in my TAC days, my Thomas Aquinas College days,
Okay.
and we're like struggling over Aristotle and Newton. It's like, oh no, is Aristotle wrong, or is Newton, is Newton wrong here? We're fighting over these things, and it's like, well, some of the times we would be like, well, how does projectile motion work for Aristotle? Well, so maybe angels are moving everything that's moving. You get things like that. And it's like, God doesn't seem to operate in that way. So yeah, maybe Newton's principles aren't right, and clearly Aristotle is working from a different framework than what we understand the world to be today. How are we going to put these things together now and kind of not, again, it's it's one of those
Yeah. No, it's
interesting.
interesting because I have a chapter in the book about Aquinas and evolution, and it's a sort of the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Where Aquinas has a certain way of understanding how the world works scientifically, right? And so some of that is just not, we found that, okay, that I was limited. It was missing certain points. But he has a very robust philosophical system that I think, and I argue in the book, can incorporate an evolutionary understanding of things, right? And there's other, much better trained philosophers, professionally trained philosophers that will argue the same thing. And I borrowed a lot from their work. But we can't, just say, oh, well, Aquinas said X, therefore we have to follow that, right? Aquinas and even Aristotle say all knowledge begins in our sense from our senses, and as we gain more knowledge to our senses, we have to refine sort of our conclusions. But it doesn't mean we throw out all of Aristotle or Aquinas. That most of what Aristotle and Aquinas said about the world, I think, resonates and makes sense. About how God is related to the world, how humans are more than just material beings, what the powers of the soul that Aquinas talks about, but there are certain things that yeah, we just got wrong. We all do, and so it's sort of integrating sort of the key aspects of what Aquinas's philosophy is and evolution, and not being led straight by, well, he didn't get this scientific fact right, and so how do we fudge that in there, right? And I think that's important in these discussions. So you don't want to limit our understanding of science based on what Aristotle or Aquinas knew, but we do want to ensure that we don't throw out everything that they have and just end up in a materialistic view of the world, that everything's mechanistic, like modern science is sort of often tries to do, right? And so I think that's the balance there.
This is again where, as you're talking about working with a philosopher, trying to bring these things together and having the good conversations, I think are so important, because so often, like as I go through again, just science, like Dalton is one of the chemists that always comes to mind as being influential in modern theory. But when I read him, I was like, philosophically, he seems wacky. It's just like, what are you talking about? But it seems like, unfortunately, at times, like he said, basically, if I'm being fair to him, he says, this is what experience shows me. This is what my scientific research shows me. I don't know what about philosophy or why it doesn't work with that. But so it's nice that well, I appreciate that there's more of this, like, wow, that's really interesting. How does that fit? Let's look further, rather than you've got to be wrong if you don't, because this shows this, and it's making you think that this is wrong over here, but that's not what it's saying. It's just saying that,
Yeah.
it's a perfect approach.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there is a lot. It is the thing. I think a lot of people don't realize that no matter anytime you're doing science and trying to understand, make sense of scientific data, people are approaching it with some philosophical bias, right? And everybody, whether you're an atheist, you're a materialist or a theist, you have a philosophical lens by which you're looking through and trying to interpret the science. A lot of times, the materialists don't even recognize that they have that lens, or that they just think they're being dispassionate. But no, you have a philosophical framework that you're committed to by which you're approaching the science. And the question, the meta question is, what's the best philosophical framework through which to make sense of the science, right? Which philosophical framework does it resonate the most with? Like, and what does it jive with our reality and our human everyday experience? And that's what good philosophy is trying to figure out what is the worldview I should have that resonates, with my everyday experience, other people's everyday experience, and what I've seen through the natural world. And I think a lot of people just don't, they think, oh, I'm just being dispassionate, just looking at the material and the physical things and what it tells me. But and that's it. There's nothing else, right? That's a philosophical lens you're looking through. And when you push them on it, it tends to not make sense of everyday experience, right? So if you are just a material being, a physical being, and that's it, all right, well, you really don't have any freedom. Your actions are just either deterministic or chaotic, but we don't act like that. We don't live like that. We live as if people have intentions and purposes, and that's how we organize society. And so there's, the world, from the scientific perspective, the world is, seems to make sense to us when we investigate it. It seems to have an order, and that order is something that our brain seems to be able to, we're able to make sense of, right? Why is that? And I think that resonates much better with a Christian view that God has created this world ordered and created us in his image to understand that order than it just if you're a materialist, that's just a freak accident that we can even understand, anything, right? So, that's a point I make, I think, near the end of the book. It's just like, everybody, because there's this idea like we're the dispassionate scientists, and these materialistic scientists who I think are on the defensive and are on their influence is waning because I think people are becoming aware of the limitations of that approach. But they often say we're the dispassionate scientists. But no, you are a committed philosophical materialist, but you're not admitting that.
Hard for them to see it. Okay.
Yeah.
Speaking to the point you wanted to make about how evolution and human evolution resonate with the Catholic understanding of the world and of the incarnation, many of the points you have just made speak to that. Is there more to say there? Or is there, I mean, there's probably a lot
Yeah.
more to say there.
Yeah,
Is
there's
there?
a lot to say there, and that's sort of going to be. I want to start working on another book that really focuses on that, the incarnation, and so the Immaculate Conception. I think there's something there that resonates with a view of evolution. And I talk about it briefly in the book, and this is actually something that my wife pointed out to me, and I put it in the book. So I owe it to my wife Nellie. Sort of her insight. If you look at how did the first humans come to exist through an evolutionary process, right? And I would argue that at a certain point, a fertilized egg in a hominid, another advanced hominid, which would be creatures very close to humans, was the type of thing was fitting to be ensouled, right? So there was a conception there at the beginning of our first human parents in non-humans, right? And people's like, oh, that seems disgusting. That seems very beneath us. Why would we be, and she's like, well, why would that be disgusting? It's like Christ. What's more scandalous? Christ became a single cell in the womb of a creature, right? So how could we argue that it would be beneath us, a human dignity, to have started from that from in the womb of a hominid? And I think there's this parallel between the conception of Mary and Christ with our first parents. And just like you see these themes there again, the Old Testament are always show up again in the New Testament, but in a higher plane, right? So initially, we were conceived, but we rejected that gift. But Mary did not, and it's even more amazing that Mary didn't, because she was surrounded by evil. Where Adam and Eve weren't, right? Our first parents weren't, right? But this conception of them points towards the Immaculate Conception and the Incarnation in a way that I think, to me, is very profound and beautiful. Like, again, how do we understand evolution? We understand it through Christ, and I think there's a beauty there, right? And it also means that our first parents, they lived a whole human life, right? So they didn't just show up at age 30, and that's what Christ did. Christ could have just shown up at age 30, gone out and done his mission and crucified. But no, he, entered our humanity from the very beginning, and was an infant in need of Mary to feed him, right? And went through the whole process. And so our first parents would have been, in the same way, although they obviously, as the church teaches, has these preternatural gifts. So they were able to learn and acquire knowledge in a way that we couldn't. But then they rejected those gifts at a certain point, right? And so they are no longer, like Mary is the Immaculate Conception, because she never rejected that gift, right? And she maintained that. So I think that I find a very, very deep synergy between the origin of humans and the two central sort of incarnation events of Mary being conceived without sin in a womb of a sinful creature, and Christ, God man, being conceived in the womb of a creature, which is just mind-boggling when you actually think about it, right? And then how could we say that if God can do that, what is to say that creation didn't prepare the womb for humans to come into existence over a long period of and God in due time when God was ready for that to happen.
I think that your distinctions, like in the chapter where you're kind of addressing that original sin, sort of like how could this happen? Was the distinction still between like what science would say this is a hominem, as you were saying, like so this
Yeah.
is this is man-like, but it doesn't necessarily mean this is man. He could be
Right.
very similar to man, but not have reason, which has to be infused, are regularly pointing out. But I think that led me to, like when you were just talking about that, that makes more sense because I think there's this idea that I had before with Darwin and the origin of species, that like you have a chimpanzee and then a man, that there's not this gradual transformation of a primate so that it is the right sort of thing to receive at some point this uh,
Yeah, the
rational.
rational soul, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly. Yeah, and that's the point where I think a Catholic understanding or a Thomistic understanding of the human person, it really is important to shed light on our understanding of evolution, right? So evolution alone is never going to be able to explain the totality of man. Like evolution is a scientific theory. It can explain a lot, right? But it's never going to be able to explain the totality of man because man is more than a material being, and that's sort of one of those truths of Genesis that we see, right? And so at a certain point in time, we believe that of all of us, like the biological process of conception cannot explain you or I, right?
right,
Totally, right? Where it's not because we are more than just a biological product of conception. We have an immaterial soul that informs that, right? And so we are both and that's where, we are both evolution and creation, right? We are created immediately by God because, but we also evolved in the sense that, the physical contributions to that make us up have evolved, but there's an instant of creation for each and every one of us, right? And the same thing with our first parents, right? And so that is an important thing to keep in mind. Evolution is not going to be able to explain that. And so hominids can be very, very, like these prehumans can be very, very similar to us in form, in biological form, right? And behaviors and abilities, but they're not going to have um, the rational soul, the reasonable, the be made in the image and likeness of God, because they're not going to be able to be in relation with God, not going to have reason and language. So they're going to be distinctly different, even though they might look very, very, very similar to us, right? And that's something to keep in mind.
You all have made reference to several parts of the book so far, and I'd love to dive more deeply into the book. This book serves as a great gift to those who are not just Catholics, but those who are on the road to conversion and find themselves hitting stumbling blocks related to these particular matters. Knowing all that, how do you like to approach a person, a seeker in this sort of space? They are trying to sort all this out, and this is kind of their big stumbling block to conversion.
Yeah, I think the book at the beginning of the book when I talk about the church's teaching on creation and interpretation of Genesis, I think is the biggest thing that it will help people in that because they often come with certain misconceptions about what the church teaches. Oh, there was no animal death before the fall, right? Well, the church doesn't necessarily teach that at all, right? And so there's certain things they get hung up on, and to look at and not, just take my word for it. Look, here's a church document from the 1800s that talks about how we should understand Genesis, or from the mid 1900s and so, or what the church fathers have said about this, right? So you see that there is this open space there where there's certain truths of Genesis, certain things that are essential about our understanding of creation, but we have a much more robust and deeper understanding of Genesis if we understand sort of the form that it's written in, right? And so I think that's the one thing that really helps. I think because I don't and I've had interactions with people that are the same thing that you're saying, that are converting or thinking of maybe of converting, but are trying to understand this hang up. And I don't want to convince them that evolution is correct. That's not my goal. I mean, I believe that's the best explanation of what's happened, but I think that's a bridge too far for them at that point. I just wanted to get to the point where they see, yeah, okay, there's openness in the Catholic understanding of creation where that could fit in. All right. So I don't have to throw that out, right? I don't necessarily agree. It's kind of weird to me. I don't fully understand it because of what their background or so forth. But and that's, the first part of the book where it's a Catholic understanding of creation, the Catholic history of how it engaged with evolution. I think that those chapters I think would be most helpful for those people. Because I'm not forcing them. You have to believe, I don't want to, well, evolution, here's the data, you have to believe, blah, 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 blah. That's not useful at that point, right? I do talk about that. In the second half of the book, it's a lot more speculative. It's a sort of speculative theology where the church hasn't said definitively on certain things, and we speculate. And if the church were to say something definitive, I would be the assent to that. But the beginning of the book is more looking at what the church really teaches about this, and that's I think the most important thing, because a lot of people are misunderstand what the church has said about creation. And think it's a lot more restrictive than what it actually is, right? So even the story of Adam and Eve, the church says, well, this is a figurative description of an actual historical event. So we don't know exactly how our first parents fall, but we do know that they did, right? And that original sin is a real thing, right? And so, all of the details of how that worked out will probably be always hidden behind the veil of history for us, right? But there's a lot of different scenarios that would be consistent with our Catholic faith, right? And that's the important thing, I think, to recognize that. And that can help people, in my experience. Yeah.
I think for me, who I've struggled with evolution because I partially didn't have the scientific background. And so my first things were just encountering, reading Aristotle and reading Darwin and thinking, okay, wrestling with that. And then not having a great knowledge of the actual science, so I remember hearing a lecture by Dr. Behe and reading his book, Darwin's Black Box. And I thought, these are really legitimate arguments about irreducible complexity. Like, if it's all random, there are steps that wouldn't be advantageous. But you've then addressed that by saying, well, nature seems to limit these things, to move towards these is what we see. So that's like, okay, that was a good objection, but now the principles that I was using for that aren't correct. So that answers that. But then also the theological points, like, well, God has to make man free to choose. He can't, I mean, he needs to be in this original state of grace at some point. So, like you said, it's speculative still, but you address that this is a question. How does man fall if he's evolved? We know it has to happen somehow like this, and there has to be something to be redeemed. Um, so again, for me, it checked all of the boxes that I need, even the parts where you go through the different types of evolution, the historical, you mentioned common descent, naturalistic, because I had questions at times with people, even just like, well, how do we really know that was that many millions of years old and the rock layers? Because I would talk to some people who didn't have good scientific knowledge, and they would say, well, we know that these fossils were from here because we radio dated it. And then I talked to somebody else and say, how do you know that the radio dating is that old? It says, well, the fossil record shows that. I was like, wait a second, this is circular.
Yeah.
But you put out the actual argument for why both the dating and the fossil record is something that you really need to look at and consider, and supports this. So I appreciated all of those different aspects. For me, you just checked all the boxes with this book.
Yeah, one of the things, that you brought up is just the science of evolution. This is one of the things I think a lot of people don't realize, and it's a very exciting time in evolutionary biology because there's a lot of sort of new, interesting, sort of naturalistic processes that people are recognizing that are more organism centric, and where organisms have certain powers to adjust and adapt. And then have those adaptations, affect their offspring, so that it's much more goal directed than, say, so this neo-Darwinian approach, right? Darwin, Darwin's ideas about evolution, he had a lot of different ideas, and then it sort of got ossified into just, random mutations and natural selection. And those do have a role, but I think there's a lot more that is that we're recognizing, where organisms have the ability to modify their own genetics. They can have certain genes that will be more likely to mutate than others. They can there's a lot of sort of directness where organisms are actually affecting their own evolution or the evolution of their own species, right? And so I think that it's a much more holistic view of evolution. It's a much more realistic view of evolution because I think it makes more sense that's part and parcel of what organisms do. I don't go too much in that in the book, but I do talk about these different ideas of evolutionary theory, and I think it's one that resonates more with the Thomistic understanding of nature and the powers of organisms. They're not just sort of blind robots getting affected by mutation, but they play a very, very active role in the process. And I think a lot of intelligent design advocates, I think, they raise good questions about, okay, well, how do we explain this? How do we explain that? And there's many questions that we still don't know in evolution. But I think particularly, in the chapter I talk about this historical evolution and common descent, I think the evidence is really sort of overwhelming for those. And then the question is, well, how did these species change over time? And that's a very interesting, fruitful area of active research, I think. And particularly in the last 20 years, it's been much more um, developed than and accepted. Like, oh, there's these other processes that probably play a large naturalistic role, and a lot of that is built upon the underlying order that's there in creation that leads to certain, we talked about before, that leads to certain things are going to evolve over and over again because the chemistry and the physics sort of help drive these things. So these physical laws that are there mean that certain things, like multicellularity, bilateral symmetry might evolve multiple times because that sort of makes sense from physical and chemical perspectives. So, yeah, so I think that's the other thing. I talked about how a lot of people don't understand creation, but I also see a lot of people, Catholics, that reject evolution tend not to really understand the actual robustness of evolutionary theory and have this misconception of it as if there's something that that it can't be done naturalistically. And I think a lot of times they have this fear that if we can explain something evolutionarily, then God is gone from the picture, and it's the exact opposite, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
and so I think but that's, I understand why they have that, because a lot of atheists, particularly in the back of the 90s and so forth, wrote books, is that we can explain everything via evolution, so we don't need God anymore, and so they got it wrong, and then some people reacted to that, but actually the Catholic position is sort of a both and. It's sort of this middle ground where, God isn't competing with natural causes. God is working through natural causes, and it's amazing what they can do.
Yeah, your explanations I thought were just spot on, and you're just really consistent with. I mean, so when you mentioned like intelligent design, I would say after reading this, it seemed to me you said yes, there's intelligent design. It's at the very molecular, the very existence of things have set up this thing to. So does that mean, yeah? So here's the problem with words, right?
Yeah.
So that's not what people mean necessarily by intelligent design. They mean like these direct miraculous interactions by the creator to carefully form something. But after reading your book, to me it's like, well, yeah, God doesn't usually work in that way. He can and does at times, but he's God. He's created all things. He didn't have to like, oh, rats, I messed that up, I now need to go and fix it. It's just there, it seems to me.
Yeah, and that term intelligent design, it's a catch-all phrase in it, and there's a lot of different people under that camp, and it's hard to even, some might actually be 7-day creationists, where some believe, evolution is a best explanation for life, and I would consider, philosophically, we're all intelligent designers, right? We all believe, by looking at creation, we can infer that there is an intelligence behind it, that there's a creator behind it. It's a Catholic position, right? And so in that sense, sense, yeah, it's just I look at the world, I see order, I see regularity, I see a magnificent order, and that then would lead me rationally to say, look, there's got to be a source of that order there, because that order just doesn't come out of nothing. And so in that sense, I would maybe philosophically, we're all intelligent designers, but then people use that term to mean all kinds of things, and so
Yeah.
you really go down rabbit holes and trying to figure out exactly what somebody means by that. But yeah, and but as Catholics, we do believe that by reason alone we can come to understand recognition that there's a creator. The revelation, we need to know, that it's a Trinitarian God and He sent His Son and so forth. But knowing that there is a creator, that's something we can know just by observing nature.
How can folks find the book?
Yeah, it's on everywhere you can buy books. It's on Amazon, but it's also on the Word on Fire bookstore online. So it's um, widely available now. So
Good deal. Good deal. So it's a very busy time for you, the start of the school year. You got a new book out in the world. That's all, both of those are, each of those is quite a lot on its own, plus family life and everything else. What else are you up to aside from those things? Because I know there's more that you've got going on. What else are you up to, and what are you looking forward to?
I'm looking for. I have a couple, talks coming up on creation and evolution, and over the next month or so. And so it's always nice to go out and do those and continue to do those. Some of the U.S. Catholic bishops are coming to a meeting at Notre Dame that I'll be at to talk about sort of science and faith issues. So I'm looking forward to that to be this winter. And so, it's an exciting time, I think, with science and faith stuff, because I really think that there's almost like a turning point here, that where young people in particularly, are becoming more open to the faith, and they're not as you know some older people have this notion that science and faith are inherently in conflict, and I think that notion is waning to some extent, and young people just don't have any notion of conflict or harmony. So so you're not having to get rid of the conflict notion with them. They're open to the idea that there's harmony because they don't have to unlearn something, right? And I think that you see article after article, all these young Catholics, all across the country and even in Europe. And I think part of it is these people aren't having to unlearn things. They're searching for meaning in their life. They just were never given anything, and so now they're open to receiving these messages. You don't have to unlearn bad messages that they might have received. So I'm excited for the future of the church and for this harmony of science and faith.
Yeah, that's definitely a reason for hope and excitement. Yes. And you mentioned the Society of Catholic Scientists, and you do a podcast for them. We say more about that.
Yeah, so we just launched it this summer. It's called the Catholic Scientists Podcast, and we have episodes come out like twice a month, and we've had like topical ones. We had somebody talking about the history of the church and science. Dr. Steve Barr did that, and we've had others where we had people talk about their scientific career and their conversion, and then we just had a philosopher on, Kenneth Kemp, who talked about his new book on Catholic evolutionism. He surveys what the Catholic Church has said over the first 100 years, or after Darwin, basically, and up to Humani Generis. And so he's very interesting, and he's gone through all the Vatican archives about all the documents that have dealt on evolution or creation and so forth during that time. So a lot of interesting content on that, and so that's an exciting thing to do, and I love sitting down talking to these people because I'm hosting it, and I always get to learn when I sit down with them, so I really enjoy it.
Very good. I'll have a link to all that in our show notes so folks can check that out. Any other resources you'd like to recommend?
Yeah, no, the Society of Catholic Sciences has a website that's got a bunch of videos and articles that get into issues about science and faith. So if you're interested in this type of stuff, there's plenty of content there to keep you busy. So I recommend that for anybody.
Okay, good deal. All right. Any final thoughts or takeaways for us?
No, I just appreciate you guys having me on, and I would encourage anybody that's interested in these issues to delve more into what the church really says about them. Look at some of the church documents, the encyclicals, and that it's written on these things. And I think you'll see over and over again that the church's position is often a both hand position, where it finds the beauty and truth in everything, and then corrects the errors in everything. It does both, right? So it corrects the errors that scientists claims that they make about the science, but it finds the beauty and truth in the actual science.
That's one of the things I've been grateful for with our Kolbe science courses, especially in high school. Our students read many of those encyclicals, and a book you've mentioned in the beginning, Pope Benedict's book in the beginning.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
Sure, glad to have your book to add to those for both our students and for seekers of all, wherever they are.
I really do recommend the book, because I think Dr. Kuebler, you've just done a great job of laying out the position in a very honest, faithful, but you make all of the great distinctions that I think this is for people who are, even if they're already in favor of evolution and in the church and things. I think this just lays everything out in a very clear way that gives you the right tools to kind of think about it and talk about it too. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. And I started this book like 12 years ago. So it's been a long journey. Maybe it was 14 now. I've lost track, but it's really in the last 5 or 6 years. And I've been blessed to do a lot of work with different philosophers and theologians who have really taught me a lot. And, and so the fruit of those conversations and what they have taught me has been able to allow me to actually write the book I could. If I would have just tried to write it and finish it 14 years ago, it would have been a mess. So I'm really in debt, and I talk about those people in the preface of the book. And so yeah, and I think that just shows to me the importance of these interdisciplinary dialogues, and having humility to recognize what you don't know and what other people are going to be able to help you with. I remember many times people say, "Dan, you can't say that. No, that's wrong." I'm like, "What?" And when I make a philosophical or a theological statement, and it still happens, and recognizing, and taking good fraternal correction, and recognizing the expertise of others is huge. When you're particularly in these issues that touch on science, philosophy, and theology.
Well, once again, congratulations. It's been such a joy to see it promoted in the Word on Fire emails that I get, and all over the place. I see it pop up, and I've been so looking forward to our conversation today. Thank you for coming to spend this time with us.
It's always nice to talk to you, Bonnie and Stephen. Just a great conversation. Thanks.
Subscribe to the Kolbecast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@kolbe.org.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Ignatius of Loyola, holy saints and angels, pray for us. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam.